Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Brooks Watson. I'm a student analyst working here with the Fair Finance team at the Beeck Center. I want to thank you all for joining us today for what promises to be an important and engaging conversation. I'd also like to take the time to thank Georgetown University and our partner for this event, Common Future. We are recording this discussion, so if you miss anything or want to share what you learn, and I think we're all going to learn a lot today, follow us on Twitter at Beeck Center, and we'll share the link to the event as soon as possible. And speaking of Twitter, we are going to be live streaming and live tweeting this event, so you can follow along and add your insights to the conversation using the hashtag hiding in plain sight. Thank you for your time. And now I'd like to introduce Erika, Seth, Davies to tell us more about today's conversation.
Thanks so much, Brooks. I appreciate your help in getting us started this afternoon. And I just want to make sure I thank all of our participants and our panelists for being here today as well. So I am a fellow, Equitable Access to Capital Markets in the Fair Finance portfolio of the Beeck Center for Social Impact and Innovation, and really excited about today's conversation and being able to offer this to our participants to focus on the asset management industry and looking at that through a race lens. So we know that the asset management world is a complex one, and the forces that have allowed it to remain largely white and male for so long are many. So poor hiring and recruiting practices, lack of media attention, dismissing performance of diverse-owned asset management firms, all contribute to maintaining the status quo. So the purpose of this discussion is less about making the case for why we should engage diverse manager, but really taking yet another step to think about this as a systemic issue that requires systemic change. So we'll be talking about some of the elements that are required to make that change in outcomes within the industry and in terms of who has access to managing assets. So we'll do that by taking an ecosystem approach that looks at how policies, practices, and cultural representations from one player in that system influence and impact the decision-making for other players in the system. Understanding how policy, both institutional and public policy, are really key levers in the method that have made race actually structural. And so we've got to look at policy as a way of addressing and dismantling the structures as well. How we use and think about data and ensuring that we can disaggregate data by race, by gender, and other social identifiers is going to be key to systemic change, but then also how to use data in terms of metrics and for accountability. And finally, ensuring that we're looking at the narrative and changing the narrative around the industry, one, regarding the opportunity for diverse managers, but then also rethinking and reframing even our concepts of risk. So we've got a great panel lined up today to help us think about, reflect on, and discuss ways of using these levers. So I'll go ahead and introduce our guests for today. They include Patrick Briaud. He is the lead for Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors Impact Investing Practice, where he helps individuals, foundations, and corporations use a range of assets to achieve their social impact goals. Brandi Colander is a principal at the Raben Group, a national public affairs and strategic communications firm. Her work includes the Diverse Asset Managers Initiative, an effort dedicated to creating a more inclusive culture in the financial services industry as it relates to asset managers. Jason Lamin, the founder and CEO of Lenox Park Solutions, a fintech company providing a collaborative software and a set of data aggregation tools in financial services. The firm's mission is to remove systemic bias and inefficient costs relating to capital access. And finally, Matt McCue, who's our moderator for today and the co-founder and editor of Emerging Manager Monthly. He's managing director of Financial Investment News and managing editor of FinDaily and Nonprofit News. He's also, again, the moderator for today's conversation. And I just want to make sure I thank and acknowledge not only the Beeck Center, but also our partner in this work, Common Future. So with that, I will hand it off to Matt so we can get started on the conversation.
Great, and Erika, thank you very much. I appreciate being able to be here and moderate the panel today. Really excited for the conversation we're going to be having. So before we get started, I have plenty of questions to get through, but I'd love to give everyone just an opportunity to maybe just introduce yourselves, give a little bit of background about yourselves and your organizations, and then we'll kick it off from there. So Jason, maybe we can start with you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Really delighted to be here, and with some friends that I've known in the industry for a long time, and some new friends that I'm excited to be collaborating with. So as Erika mentioned, I'm the CEO and founder of Lenox Park Solutions. We're a fintech company, and really the mission of our organization is to democratize access, and particularly focusing in the asset management community, where access to capital has some very, very obvious biases. And so our platform is, our flagship platform is called Roundtables. And there are essentially two verticals in Roundtables. One is collaborative software focused, and the other is data aggregation, where we come up with metrics and standardized tools for participants in asset management to be able to further their mission of their organization.
Great, thanks, Jason. And Patrick, I'll throw it over to you.
Thanks, Patrick Brio, the head of impact investing at Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. And we help essentially asset owners that are mission driven to shift their portfolios. Most germane to this conversation, I think, is the recently published Impact Investing Handbook, which is essentially a book-length, open-sourced guide for the full journey that asset owners are on to shift their portfolio. And we'll be diving in quite a bit to the who chapter along the way.
Thanks. And Brandy?
Hi, everyone. Brandy, Colander. I'm a principal with the Raben Group, and we also have an independent 501c3 called the Diverse Asset Managers Initiative, really dedicated to sort of what Erika was lifting up before, highlighting the opportunity and the disparities in equity when it comes to working with asset managers, people of color, and women. Look forward to the discussion today.
Great. So to kick it off, Patrick, I'd love to turn it over to you. As you mentioned, you recently worked on the Impact Investing Handbook, and I think kind of from the broader framing of this discussion, that might be a great place to start. Would be to talk a little bit about that that handbook that you put together, and as you mentioned, specifically the chapter that looks at the who component of this topic.
Great. The framing for us, this handbook essentially walks through the what of impact investing. How do you define the boundaries of it? The who are the participants? The why and a theory of change, to then add to the how, which is the tools and structures that asset owners can use, to the so what, which is the evaluation framework connected to your why, and then the now what, best practices for moving forward. And so when we think about the who, particularly for this moment in time, I think it's important to set the full context of the capital chain. So how does an asset owner's money actually make its way from their bank account all the way to the customers and beneficiaries of the eventual investees of their portfolio? And so I think one of the most important baseline messages here is that the full capital chain matters when we're talking about the who. So when you think about not only the ultimate beneficiaries and customers of the company, roll it back to the company itself, what are the policies and what's the mission orientation of that organization, what's the makeup of that organization, rolling it back to asset managers. So let's just call it fund managers, for example, and then rolling it back to advisors, and then again to the asset owner who's shaping that. The second big piece of this is who you are as the asset owner matters, and we all need to take ownership of who we are. For me personally, I would say even early on the journey of recognizing that if by some measures 90% of investment decisions are made by white men, what is the role that I play as one of those to change the conversation? If white men are the first to speak up in almost every conversation except this one, how can we actually force a bit more of a conversation to say, I'm new to this journey, how can I actually take part and then shift assets in accordance with that?
So Jason, I was saying, I was looking to throw it over to you with the concept of, really taking the discussion of the who and be able to provide metrics around it. And that's been a lot of the work that your firm has done, is trying to help, put some numbers and some broader understanding around it, not only for diverse managers, but also just for allocators and managers of all shapes and sizes and makeups. So can you talk a little bit about some of that work you've been doing there, specifically around the metrics, and then just how important being able to have numbers to kind of further this discussion and put more of the discussion into action is?
Sure. So I'll start off by saying that, we're encouraged as a firm as to where we are in this conversation, because I think finally we're starting to see some participants in the industry really step up and embrace transparency, which is required, and embrace a metrics-driven approach to solving this problem. So, there's not an organization that's successfully run in 2020 that isn't measuring the things that matter to them. And so one very, very quick litmus test for us when we're meeting with any participant in this industry that's saying they want to do something is, how are you measuring it today? And if there's a lot of hums and haws about, and moving around, then we know sort of where it sits in the prioritization of that organization. But a lot of organizations have we've seen, very, very speedy adoption of our metrics-driven approach and the impact scoring around diversity. And we think of these scores as, it's essentially like a FICO score for assessing diversity at an organization. And there's a lot of encouragement that can come into this conversation when we give people a scoring methodology that's transparent and provides a roadmap to improvement. So on the LP side of the equation, for the allocators of capital, this is actually a way to hold their asset managers accountable for diversity at their firm. And it's not just the diversely owned firms that we're bringing into the conversation, but to Patrick's point, we have to bring everybody into this conversation. One study suggested that less than 1.5% of the assets in the industry of 70+ trillion, depending on how you measure it, are managed by women or people of color. If we're not speaking to the other 98.5%, or as Patrick alluded to, the 90% of white males who are in decision-making roles, we're missing a real opportunity to shift the needle. And metrics are a way to actually just show who's in leadership, to show improvement over time, because that's an important factor. We have to sort of meet the market where it is. We know that the industry has not done a very good job with respect to women and people of color in particular. But we have to meet the market where it is, and being able to assess by assigning a score, benchmarking those scores against what the market looks like, and then monitoring improvement over time is something that everybody is welcome. The allocators are welcome, that the asset managers are also, a lot of whom are really trying to do something about this, but have been looking for a roadmap in how to improve. So the metrics, there's nothing like data to point out the problem and also acutely point out where within this sort of broad diversity discussion the real problems are. And we're able to drill down with that data and arm our clients with those metrics. It's a pretty exciting time, I think.
And Brandy, kind of along those lines, a lot of the work that the Diverse Asset Managers Initiative has done has been around trying to work with the consultants, and gatekeepers are certainly a big component of how allocators and managers can come together. Can you talk a little bit about the efforts that Dami has done in that arena, and how you've been looking to kind of take this coordinated effort of improving the culture of the asset management space?
Thanks, Matt, of course. So one, I just want to sort of hat tip to Erika and her vision, because in sort of prepping for this call briefly, it's clear that we're all doing very similar work, but the whole goal is to find different and new ways to nudge. And I think whenever that happens, the brass tacks is that there's something more afoot. And the Diverse Asset Managers Initiative exists to be a fundamental partner in being able to move the conversation forward. With that said, I really appreciate sort of what Jason was lifting up about the metrics. This is a space that heavily depends on data and is incredibly opaque when it comes to transparency. And so over time, we're finding that there is more of a willingness to demonstrate some vulnerability. And I also appreciate Patrick's point, where we all have to sort of recognize our respective privilege and be able to have maybe uncomfortable and charged conversations to be able to recognize that this is not about anything other than performance and some acknowledgement of an implicit bias, right? And so I think if we can get honest with ourselves to have that discourse, we can really start to figure out how to make sure that we are creating accountability when it comes to upholding a fiduciary duty around performance. If you do not have high-performing, women-owned, diverse asset managers at the table, you're not going to get the best yield. It is that simple. And so I think what we really exist to do as a diverse asset managers initiative is to create sort of curated experiences, partner with people who maybe traditionally didn't appreciate that other folks either existed, or how to sort of make sure that there's a way to connect to be able to move the end game forward. And to your question, Matt, one of the ways that we do that annually is through a survey. A survey we found to be a really effective tool because it allows us to facilitate a conversation around baseline data. It could be that you don't play ball at all. That's a data point. It could be that you do play ball and you overshare and you realize, wow, I'm actually doing really well in this particular space, on this particular metric. And so we did start to, we've over the years spent some time going back and forth as to like what the right audience is. And what we have found is that the investment consulting firms hold an incredible amount of power because they are the portal of access. And so we are asking them probing questions to better understand what the demographics look like with respect to the access that they're providing to their clients.
And Patrick, one of the things I was going to ask you later on, but Brandy really kind of brought it up, was the issues around fiduciary responsibility, and that certainly comes up a lot with impact investing broadly, and as Brandy mentioned, comes up when talking about oftentimes just diverse managers and how to bring them into the conversation in the appropriate way. Can you talk a little bit about your work and where those two things intersect, and how allocators should be thinking about the importance of these initiatives and how they are not moving away from their fiduciary responsibility and actually a key component of it?
Yeah, thank you, Brandy, for teeing that up. It is the most significant misconception related to this broader topic of impact investing and integrating values. There's the more casual, siloed mentality of here's my investments, here's my philanthropy, and we shouldn't mix the two. And it really centers on this idea of fiduciary duty. One of the most interesting indicators from Milton Friedman, decades ago, saying really the purpose of the business is to provide financial returns to the stakeholders, to the Business Roundtable coming out last year and saying, no, that's actually no longer the case. We as a community of CEOs of the largest corporations are saying we're shifting that idea from the word shareholder to the word stakeholder, which is much broader and actually has impact integrated into that. You see shifts, BlackRock and Larry Fink's annual letter, and these sorts of developments that's really becoming mainstream. The key, I think, is to remember that your fiduciary duty is not, there's no compromise with impact. The key is to figure out what are you actually trying to achieve, and then what are the regulations that govern that particular body. So if you're, for example, a charitable institution, you need to be looking at things like ERISA laws and how does your essentially impact prudence plus your financial prudence add up to your fiduciary duty. Essentially, if you're a mission-driven organization, you really can, for lack of a better term, concede some returns if it's aligned with your charitable purpose. So a lot more details and even case studies in the handbook if that's helpful. But it's just not the case that there's a conflict inherently. There could be, but it's not an inherent conflict.
And Matt, can I just build on a little bit?
Absolutely.
by way of background, I spent a lot of time in environmental law and policy, and on a leadership council for Yale. And so one of the things I started noticing maybe 10 years ago, to Patrick's point around social impact investing and the ESG sort of environmental social governance movement, is this real push from an endowment perspective. And of course, it's driven by, they say youth is wasted on the young, but they really are, quite frankly, allowing them, I think, older generations to see a different form of leadership. So hat tip to them in terms of what they were able to do with divesting from coal at Yale in our endowment many years ago. And that's, of course, taken on a broader meeting in the context of like corporate governance. And I think there's a little bit of a conflation that does happen that I want to be sensitive to and flag here, because you don't want to put too many buckets in the same bucket, because then you distill the nuance of each special area, and there's a lot of advocacy that needs to be lifted up in each. But I will say that there is a real performance piece that we really have to make sure we acknowledge, because when it comes to coal being, beaten out by natural gas, for example, we're not asking for people to take subpar asset managers. That is not at all the ask. The ask is absolutely to make sure that you are being more thoughtful and intentional about making sure that investment consulting firms, for example, provide you with a slate that includes more diverse asset managers. And we've also seen this level of accountability start to gin up a bit at the SEC, and they're actually having a meeting next week on diverse asset managers. And I think that that's going to be another opportunity for the first time under their chair's leadership to really move this conversation forward, and we should hold them to account.
Hey, Matt, if I might just add to that, those excellent points. But one of the things that we're also seeing with some of the allocators that have really sort of approached this with a level of thoughtfulness and seriousness, and aren't just reacting or responding to the last, sort of the current events, but people that have been really thinking about how to approach this space. I think we're narrowing in and getting to the conclusion that, every dollar allocated has impact. And it's just a fact, and metrics, and where we sort of come into the conversation with those clients is that a lot of our clients are starting to look and saying, well, how much of my dollar when I allocate to this manager is having an impact on diversity, equity, and inclusion? And I can impact weight my allocations. In fact, I can impact weight my entire portfolio with respect to DEI if I have these metrics for all the external managers that I allocate to. And the truth is that might actually be a more effective and sustainable way of measuring the impact we're having as a firm over time. Can we start with, a X percent of our portfolio is having DEI impact? And the next year when our board meets to talk about this, or the next quarter, we're going to measure that number. And every time we make an allocation, we're going to ask enough questions so that we know, again, to Brandy's very excellent point, this is not about reducing or eroding your performance standards. In fact, you must uphold those. It's about ensuring that the universe from which you are picking investments is inclusive. And we know right now it's not. But as you make those allocations, it is important to know how much of that dollar has diversity, equity, and inclusion impact. And over time, we're just now starting to see some of our clients who now have a quarter of information to measure the improvement in their portfolio. And that's how they hold themselves accountable. And that's how they work with their partners or asset managers that they allocate to hold them accountable as well.
And Jason, actually probably ties in pretty well to throw a couple of the questions from our audience in. One of the attendees had a question for you, talking about what would you say are some of the greatest hurdles to actionable data in terms of understanding and driving racial equity through investments, and what are some of the common missteps in choosing the right metrics or questions to ask that you've seen?
I think that the biggest hurdle that that we can think of so far is just getting all participants comfortable, and it's happening a lot faster today, that this is an important part of investment decision making. And so being open and transparent with these metrics is just as important as being open and transparent with your track record and your past performance and other things. And arming the LPs and the investors with the right questions that give the right results so that they can ask those questions. Diversity tends to be this sort of big, broad thing. And we've seen people with 20-page questionnaires and 200 questions and some with 3 questions. Through data science and AI and having been at this for a long time, and I think we have probably the richest data set on diversity in asset management. We've used a lot of technology to hone in on exactly which questions get you the outcome that you're looking for, which is how we get our score. But we also get a pretty complete picture of what the inclusion culture is at a firm. So empowering the allocators and the LPs with the tools to be able to ask the right questions, getting the GPs and managers comfortable with the fact that this is not going to change. We're not going back. We're going to ask questions about what the demographics are of your firm. And LPs are going to want to know if you've had, sexual harassment lawsuits at your firm. These things around inclusion are going to be part of decision making. And that's happening, Matt, because even though we've done a terrific job of studying this problem. In fact, I keep saying that any other research that's done around studying the problem, may be more of a distraction at this point. We know what the problem is. And again, to Brandy's point, thank you for Erika for bringing tools here. But we know what the problem is. We know all of the research points to the fact that diverse teams spark more innovation and creativity. They're happier places to work. The performance is there with the diverse team. So we know the benefits. We're aware of the social responsibility. We're aware that there's been no evidence that you have to give up performance to invest with diverse managers. What we haven't talked enough about is the risk. The risk with investing in a manager who doesn't have an inclusive culture. And we saw a little bit of that with Franklin Templeton in Central Park, with Amy Cooper in Central Park. Now, there's no causality there, and I don't want to sort of pretend there is, but at some point you have to look and say, is Amy Cooper a symptom of the firm that she's part of or the industry that she's part of? And so, looking at the risk and looking at diversity through the lens of risk is an important element that we haven't gotten to. But in terms of hurdles, it's just getting people comfortable in saying that this is data that is required to make investment decisions. And, we're going to be asking it, and more LPs are getting comfortable asking it.
And Brandy, along those lines, I know Dami had done some work around creating I believe it was a trustee guide that kind of helped give them a lot of the information that they needed to be able to progress this discussion into further action at their organizations. Can you talk a little bit about what Dami has done to really help move this from a discussion into actionable ways that trustees or CIOs or investment staff or really any of the key people helping kind of push these decisions forward are able to kind of take that next step?
Happily, thank you. So the guide, thank you for that, is on our website. So I won't dive deep there, but just direct folks to it. One of the things that I think is really helpful about the exercise of the survey and the data collection is just that you do get a sense of the importance of fellowship and convenings. And so, of course, we're in this COVID era, but there are some conferences that people really do find beneficial. And I think that all gets to the core of this being a heavily relationship-based industry. To Jason's point about risk and risk management, you need to feel good about where you're entrusting large assets. And so circles become small, they become tight, they become relationship oriented. So creating spaces and opportunities for there to be pollination and relationship building is absolutely core and critical. But I do think outside of sort of a guide where you can help walk people through that and sort of socialize them to things that we think are helpful practices, there are some core opportunities just to continue building off of what Jason was sharing in previous questions around definitions. And so you can ask a ton of questions. And I think it's clear that Jason and team have been able to really figure out the science behind that. But I would push for us to have even more, especially when it comes to the way that regulators are asking questions. So ONWE within SEC, for example, they have a survey, very tepid response, if you will, in terms of the number of return surveys that they received. And I think that they recognize that and are doing work to improve that. In addition to that, let's start to use terminology that is more inclusive and not chastising. If you have $1, $2, or $6 billion AUM, then that should not mean you're emerging, perhaps, right? So would you take your child to an emerging doctor is sort of a side conversation I've had with a few people in this space. We want to make sure that we're not creating terminology that's going to have a chilling effect on folks who are absolutely credentialed and credible in this space. And then when it comes to diversity, it is fascinating to see the many interpretations of how people will show up in terms of the way that they look at their diversity for the purposes of creating a survey, when we're really just trying to create the space to have a conversation to say, what do your demographics really look like? Who are you able to reach, and how can we help facilitate and maybe make that more inclusive and broader? So if you don't have sort of a baseline of definitions to have that conversation, I think you will continue to find really creative and less transparent engagement on some of these issues. And Dami,
so along those,
yeah, my last point just there is that Dami is thinking about some of the policy and who the right partners in thinking through that policy opportunity is.
and kind of along the lines of what you were just talking about, one of the questions from one of our attendees was around the fact that understanding that a lot of diverse managers, while they might have the performance, they generally won't meet a lot of the assets under management requirements for coverage. How are any of you seeing policies being changed to integrate that more into how allocators are thinking about bringing diverse managers to the table, when generally speaking, they are going to have smaller asset bases, in terms of looking at the broader space? Have you seen any adjustments there? How is that hurdle? A lot of plans, for example, have we can't be more than 10% of your strategy type approach to how they make investments. Are you seeing any adjustments or any way that that's being addressed by some of these larger allocators? And Billy, anybody can take that one.
I can, maybe chime in with, what we're seeing from some of the data. I think that is going to change very shortly, Matt, because we're now at a point where at sort of the board and trustee level, the highest levels, there's a lot of attention on this issue. And what we can all agree on is that the outcomes are unacceptable. And, I'm delighted to hear, about the work and the partnership with Dami and the investment consulting space, because that is a space that really does need to own a big part of this conversation. They are such a meaningful player in that space. But there are enough eyes on an unacceptable outcome that finally everybody's looking at what the inputs are. I mean, when we don't like the way things are, we have to go back and look at what the inputs are and disaggregate where policies are, unintentionally screening out a large part of this universe. And that is unequivocally one of them. And in fact, it might be one of the easiest of them. So now we're actually able to look and say, well, what is the root concern about having that policy in place? And we don't go and tell people how to write their policies, but we point out that this is where the bottleneck is. And if you have this, what we now have as a company here at Lenox Park is a data set, and we can say, you're going to be looking at 10 hedge funds that are minority owned or woman owned. And so if you don't have any in your portfolio, it's because the universe that you've allowed yourself to pick from is 10. If you were to change your policy, and we can give them the toggles and triggers to do this, here's how big your universe becomes. But we also kind of go, a step further, and at some point, this is all about intentionality. You have to want to do it. And, you have to want to take your policy and revisit all of the specific issues and determine whether what those policies are in place for and what the cost of having those policies is. And here, the cost is we have not moved the needle on diverse managers in 2 decades.
And Patrick, kind of along those lines, a little plug for Emerging Manager Monthly I'll throw in here is our July issue, we did our second annual study that looked at women and minority CIOs among the largest public pension funds and foundations and endowments. And in terms of minority CIOs, there was 15% of the top 100 public defined benefit plans had a minority CIO, and on the foundation endowment side, it was 13%. So when you talk about supply chain and understanding where impact can be made and how you can address some of these issues, how much of it has to start from the top down? How can you address things that are in the middle or towards the bottom of the chain? Can you talk a little bit about, through your research, the different ways that you can kind of approach this problem from, high levels and on all the way down? Sure.
And briefly, to continue on Jason's point, just making a quick analogy to the overhead myth in grant making. For a long time, many assumed that the best grant that you make is that with the lowest administrative costs. And the idea is that's not at all an important metric. In fact, it could be the opposite, that reinvesting in your organization is really important. So it's the beginning of a conversation and to really reassess, are you asking the right questions and what are the costs of asking the wrong questions? So really appreciated those comments, Jason. To that question of essentially who's making the change, a quick anecdote. We live a few blocks away from one of the gathering places of the recent protests, Grand Army Plaza. And I noticed something spray painted on the wall that said, thanks for the post, now what? So essentially, thank you for the public conversation, but what are you, Patrick, doing about it? And so I think the answer to where should the change be driven by, it's really any place along the capital chain or even whoever you are stewarding what you have. So all assets have impact, right? It's not an intention of do I or do I not pursue impact investing or pursue this particular lens. But it's companies in my portfolio are doing things out in the world. They have supply chains, they have employees, they have products and services that are making a difference. And the idea is get to know what's happening with data sets like Jason's, and then try to shift that towards the positive. So that's the first step. The second thing is that systems change has never been so tangible as it is today. The effects of bad systems is right outside of our windows, and it's on our news stations. So taking ownership of that and saying, where do I participate and how can I play a difference? Obviously, if you have more power, there's more to be stewarded towards this conversation.
Hey, Matt, can I just add a little bit to that? Because there's some really interesting sort of insights and patterns that we're starting to see with some of the data in our Roundtables platform. And, when it comes to decision making, and I love some of the things that Dami's doing about, really focusing on policy at the institutional level, because, it really starts with boards and governance. And there's been a massive push, over the last few months about, making sure that there is representation on boards. This is such an important part. It's where all of the policies are set. It's where the accountability measures and the expectations are set. So being able to start with who's on the boards, who's setting policy, who's setting the expectations and setting the accountability measures. And if you look there, you'll start to see why things are or are not happening at the organizations. And I can tell you that the correlations are strong. Some of the things that we're starting to see, and I loved the issue in Emerging Manager Monthly pointing out the diversity at some of the CIO ranks, or lack thereof, depending on how you're looking at the number. But it's good to see the numbers. And some of the patterns that we're seeing in Roundtables, as I mentioned, there are really two things that our platform does. We we help LPs collaborate with each other and investors collaborate with each other, but we gather a lot of data. Well, when we look at what's happening on the collaborating side of things, and this is a platform where I think as of today, we've had investors that share where they're investing with their like-minded peer groups. We've had about 98 billion of investments shared, about 525 asset managers. A lot of those are diverse managers because we have a peer organized domain that's sponsored by Prudential, and they're collaborating with a group of their LPs around diverse managers. And so they've centralized this database. When we look at the patterns of who's collaborating in that platform, because we can see who reads research and posts it, and we can see who goes in and upvotes it and likes it and comments on it, and we can see who meets a woman-owned manager and promotes that manager to create visibility for them in their peer network. The demographics of those collaborators also tells us something powerful, and it makes a very strong case for getting women and people of color into these decision-making roles.
Yeah, if I can, I just, I completely echo that. I think that it's very clear in our work that being able to build allies from a governance perspective at that leadership level creates a lot of accountability. And quite frankly, another role that I find us playing is a bit of a sort of facilitator in supporting some of these affinity group asset managing organizations like the NAICs in being able to also get more access to some of these organizations. And so, there's the confluence of all of the things that are happening sort of within the Beltway, and 2019 marked the first year where we had the first House Financial Services Subcommittee on Diversity and Inclusion, right? And so we can start to use these different levers that creatures of DC, if you will, spend a lot of time and energy trying to influence because they do matter, and they create records and they create that accountability. And I think the more, to your point, Jason, that we don't just look at the consultants that feed the clients that can create the demand, but also the governing entities through the boards, that ecosystem that Erika spoke to earlier really does start to sort of work in tandem with one another, and it becomes powerful, and it certainly will lead to stronger performance.
And really along those lines from the comments that each of you are making, when you think about the emerging manager space and where a lot of the activity has come from, a lot of it has been legislatively driven. You've seen a lot of states, Illinois, for example, being a big leader in terms of requiring certain percentage of assets to be included with women, minority, and disabled-owned managers. How do you take the conversation and expand it out into the places where that's not a requirement, and it's something where it has to be board-driven or policy-driven at a place where it's not because they're being told they have to hit a certain metric, but just because they see it as a good opportunity? I know, Brandy, with Dami, there's been a lot of work trying to address endowments and trying to get in front of them and push them to recognize that they need to be more diverse with their manager rosters. Can you talk a little bit about how this conversation expands to the places where it's not a requirement? The consultants that aren't being told that they have to report on the number of diverse manager searches or interviews that they have each year. How do you bring those people into the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think the short answer is if we were done, we wouldn't be in business. But I think that the reality is there's still a lot of work to do. And with respect to endowments, I feel like thank you for that, Matt. It's happening, it's working, things are moving, and we're encouraged. And I would say that it is again a moment and the confluence of things where we have leadership from the University of California, where they're starting to demonstrate some of a firmer commitment to transparency and sharing numbers. We are doing outreach and nudging others. The good Reverend Al Sharpton with National Action Network is also doing very targeted outreach and looking to hold folks accountable. And I will say that having a lot of students at home creates another advocacy moment and platform opportunity for them, because they now understand the business model a little bit more with respect to what their tuition dollars are going towards investing in through the endowments. And we have student newspapers that have a lot of time. And so we've found that that has been a very effective platform to raise awareness. And I think a lot of the work that we do day in and day out, honestly, Matt, and this is sort of a hat tip to you, quite frankly, is through the power and the platform of good journalism and being able to use communications to share, so that it gives political cover and, quite frankly, doesn't require asset managers, perhaps of color or women, who don't feel like they can provide the same voice to these issues, but absolutely need support. And so we hear that quietly, and DAMI serves to try and amplify that as much as possible. And then again, of course, sort of to Jason's points earlier about the importance of governance, and then just sort of our expertise, if you will, with respect to understanding the way Washington, D.C. really functions. And in states where we don't have that sort of legislative capacity, it is through advocacy that we build it.
So, Patrick, this might be oh, go ahead, Jason.
Well, I was just going to say, I really want to buttress that point that Brandy just made, and the importance of advocacy, and Patrick made this point earlier. There is risk to diverse managers, women, people of color who are trying to grow their businesses, attract assets under management, and they have to do the majority of that through the consulting network. So you are going to be hard pressed to find a manager that's willing to be critical of the hand that must feed them the way the structure is now. So consultants rarely hear from managers, any of the criticism. This is why it's so powerful, the work that you do, and some journalists, but probably not enough. At some of the major publications, I think it's got to be a little bit more investigative, and I think it's got to dig deeper, and it's got to be the voice on behalf of those who, given the system, cannot voice their criticism. The managers show up at the conferences and they do everything politely and nicely because they must. But make no mistake, the system is broken and it shuts them out. And so, I think that more can be done to amplify, as Brandy, quite rightly put it, to amplify the voice of criticism, to ask the LPs and the allocators to be a little bit more introspective about how ready their platforms are to be inclusive. I'm very curious, and we've been trying very hard to get LPs to open up and let us evaluate their diversity of their investment teams. They've not been as willing to do that as they are to do it with managers, but some are. And, so I think that we could probably use the press and advocacy groups to do the criticizing that needs to happen for the industry to improve when the managers can't do it for themselves.
And that's certainly a topic I could talk about for a long time. I know it's something that over the last couple of years, we've really tried to use our voice with Emerging Manager Monthly to start to call that out. And certainly Robert Raben is well known for his willingness to speak his mind. So it's certainly, I think it could be a whole other topic on its own. But Patrick, to bring it back to some other of the questions that we're getting that are coming through, one of the interesting thing that's been talked about, and one of the things that we've tried to highlight through some of our coverage, is the concept of an increased representation of diverse asset managers in the capital chain, helping to maybe increase the flow of capital to low-income communities and communities of color. How with so much barriers to increasing the capital flows to these communities, how can these flows of capital to low-income communities increase while maintaining returns and managing risk for investors?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think getting to know the actual barriers for, let's say, a disadvantaged business owner in a particular community to access capital is really important. To actually have conversations to understand those. We do work with a number of community foundations, for example, that are trying to understand how do we get capital to those who can't access it, and using existing rails that are tried and true, like CDFIs, for example, community banks that have essentially been doing this for decades and leverage what exists out there. A couple other tools that are important to think about. One is the difference between a theme and a lens when you look at a portfolio. So a theme is more specific to a sector, let's call it education, whereas a lens is more something that gets layered across a portfolio, and you're actually measuring the whole portfolio on that. So gender lens has been one that's fairly well established at this point, and I think there's more and more on sort of an equity lens. So it's not necessarily I want to go deep in one particular asset class with this theme, but I want to layer it across the whole. So that's one thing. Another thing is using the capital stack to your advantage. So is there a way for someone who is a little more kind of on the bandwagon, if you will, to take a junior position in the capital stack to attract a larger investor to really prove the concept? Obviously, getting those assets up, attracting attention to the places that need it. In some of these conversations, it's much more about a carrot than it is a stick. So really having to say, this will lead to better outcomes, and here are the reasons why. Here's what you care about, and here's how this will get it to you through data, advocacy, and knowing your audience are all kind of key lessons to getting people on board.
Hey,
another question go ahead, Jason.
All right, I was just going to add to that because Patrick brings up a great point and ties into a point that we were talking about earlier, which is the importance of, sort of some of this catalytic investing. Allocators being aware of the value of their dollar. We have a client now who's starting to look at data and analysis that says, when we back a manager, when we find a woman or a minority owned or led asset manager, when we come in as an LP, acknowledging who we are in this space, and they're a large one, what does that mean for their AUM growth right after that? And it's actually pretty powerful. And so I think it ties back to the question before, when an allocator comes in and says, well, we can't write $100 million check to a manager because they're going to be too much of their, well, that's because you're looking at that $100 million in the same way, and you're not thinking about it in terms of catalytic investing. When a big, well-known institution with a reputation backs a manager with $100 million, the outlook for that manager is entirely different than what you're looking at right then. And so acknowledging that is a really important thing. And again, we're now able to start looking at what does it mean when we come in with our dollars, what does that mean for the trajectory? And it tells a pretty compelling story about why that concern should be sort of level set, let's say.
And if I can just, Jason, that just goes back to the point earlier around being intentional. I mean, and it's, I led earlier with, we have to enter this discourse honestly. There is an implicit bias, and this just requires us shifting the paradigm and trusting, because the numbers show you that performance is not the compromise, truly.
Right.
So from that perspective, if I'm somebody that's interested in, I've listened to this and I say, you know what, I'm gonna do something about this webinar. Everybody had such great points, and I'm ready to start looking at how we can do it. Do you have kind of a idea of where would you suggest somebody starts? Is there a general starting point that's a great place for them to begin this journey?
I would definitely say go to our website, which I know you all are making accessible, and I would take a look at our 2019 study. We are going to do one for 2020, of course. And so in upcoming months, you can keep your eyes peeled for that and look at the comparison. Look at the number of people who participate this year as compared to last year. I also think you can look at sort of the spread of how people distinguish themselves when it comes to diversity. We really do try to offer layman's terms with respect to being able to make this accessible to everyone who just wants to understand the issue more broadly. And I would continue to keep your eyes peeled around endowments. and creating more accountability there. I think the student body, the students are activated, and I also think that there is clearly a commitment by the Reverend Sharpton and others, and endowments are starting to take note.
Matt, I'm assuming you mean in terms of an investor or an allocator that wants to get more diversity into their portfolio. Well, of course, we're data nerds, and we would say you have to measure where you are right now. So if we would say measure what you're doing right now and what your approach is, and put some real data behind it. That's the easy one. But actually, maybe the more important one that isn't talking our own book. The more important one, because I think this is severely destructive to the effort, is that you have to be honest about how authentic your organization wants to be about this issue. There's very little I can think of that's more destructive than a lot of the headline grabbing and a lot of the inauthentic rhetoric and approaches into this space that just suck up the oxygen. So, it's just some basic things. It's expensive for managers to be running around the country meeting with you if there's really no intention or conviction in actually doing the work to invest. So I would say that, start by understanding exactly where your organization is. If there is not the support at the top, and it's going to be sort of inauthentic, really you do much better for the industry in continuing to stay on the sidelines. But if you're going to get into it, then to Brandy's point, there has to be a level of intentionality. There's going to be some uncomfortable things that you're going to have to do when you deconstruct systems that have been so biased. So get ready for that part of it. But I think being honest with yourself, your organization, about what you really intend to do in the space is really positive for the whole industry.
And if I can, Jason,
yeah, go ahead.
The pieces there is, the data sets that you're creating are so valuable, and we just need more. Quite frankly, we just need more. I also will say one of the things that DAMI does is curate roundtables to create access to asset managers for broader portfolios, and to that point, I do think that is absolutely critical and valuable, because as I mentioned earlier, this is a relationships business. And if folks can't get comfortable with one another, you're not going to make these deeper investments fiscally or in time and energy, sort of to Jason's point. So I do think it may take a few bites at the apple, quite candidly, and over time you do get there. But one of the things that we are intentional about doing is curating small roundtable discussions to create more direct access. And then you allow people to do the pitch and see where things go and create accountability about the follow-up there.
Patrick, I'll give you the final word here.
Oh gosh. All I would say is know what you own, know what you currently own. Ask those who are managing your money the question. So start the conversation, and that could be a very fancy, Wall Street bank, or it could just be your employer who has a certain subset of mutual funds in your 401k.
So unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for today. It's a dialogue that can certainly continue, and in fact will be continuing. This was part one of the series. Part two of this series will be in 3 weeks on July 29th. At 3 p.m., where a whole new panel will look at solutions for fighting racism in the asset management industry. So please be sure to register for that event as well. I think it'll be a really nice follow-on to the dialogue that we had here today. So once again, I want to thank our panelists, Patrick, Brandy, Jason, for a great conversation. Special thanks to Erika for bringing everyone together today. I also want to thank the Beeck Center and their team, Ori, Diana, Celine, and Brooks, for all the work backstage, and a special shout out to Common Future for their support of this series as well. So we appreciate all your great questions. We hope we were able to get to most of them. We appreciate your interest in the subject, and I hope we can all do better in the future. So thanks, and everyone, and have a great day.